The morning smells of salt and diesel, and something burning. It is June 6, 1944. The sky above the English Channel is the color of a bruise, purple-gray, low, heavy with the weight of what is about to happen. Somewhere in the dark water beneath that sky, 14,000 Canadian soldiers are climbing down rope nets into flat-bottomed boats that groan and pitch against the hulls of troop transports. The men are soaked before they reach the water. They are cold. Some are vomiting. Most are praying, quietly, privately, in the language of men who have made peace with the possibility that this is the last morning they will ever see. Their destination is a stretch of beach on the Norman coast the planners have named Juno. To the Germans waiting behind that beach, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had watched entire Soviet armies shatter against their defenses, these Canadians were an afterthought, a colonial force, a secondary concern. That belief would not survive the morning. To understand what happened at Juno Beach, you have to understand the weight of expectation pressing down on the entire operation before a single boot touched sand. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe, was the most complex military undertaking in human history. It had been planned for over a year. It had been debated, revised, argued over, and nearly cancelled more times than anyone cared to admit. The stakes were absolute. If the landings failed, if the Germans drove the Allies back into the sea, there would be no second attempt. For years, the war in the Pacific would drain resources. Stalin, fighting alone on the Eastern Front for 3 years, would be left to wonder whether the Western democracies had the stomach for sacrifice. Everything depended on the next 24 hours. The Normandy plan divided the landing zone into 5 beaches across a 50-mile stretch of French coastline. American forces would hit Utah and Omaha on the western flank. British forces would assault Gold and Sword on the eastern flank. In the center, between Gold and Sword, in the gap that neither army could adequately cover, sat Juno Beach. Juno was assigned to the Canadians. It was not a coincidence. It was a decision born from hard experience, bitter memory, and 2 years of deliberate preparation. The Canadians had been here before, in a sense, not at Normandy, but at a place that still haunted them. Dieppe, August 19, 1942. Nearly 2 years earlier, over 6,000 men, the majority of them Canadian, had been thrown against the heavily fortified port of Dieppe in a raid that became, in the cold accounting of history, a catastrophe. In less than 10 hours, over 3,000 Canadians were killed, wounded, or captured. The seawall, the shingle beach that jammed weapons and bogged boots, the machine guns positioned so high on the cliffs they couldn't be suppressed by naval fire, tanks that drowned in the surf, men cut down before they could stand upright. Dieppe was a failure of planning, of intelligence, and of tactical imagination. It was also, though it cost a terrible price, an education. The Allies studied Dieppe the way a surgeon studies a wound. Every tactical lesson was absorbed. The beaches needed to be more carefully surveyed. Fire support needed to be heavier and better coordinated. Specialized armor, tanks modified specifically for beach obstacles, was developed. Landing craft needed to land men directly on the beach rather than making them wade through chest-deep water. Engineers needed to breach obstacles before the infantry arrived. And the Canadians, the men who had paid in blood at Dieppe, were the ones who internalized those lessons most deeply. By the time the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade began training in England for Operation Overlord, they had been shaped by grief into something harder and sharper. They had practiced their landings dozens of times. They knew the revised tactics cold. They understood at a cellular level what went wrong at Dieppe, and they had built an entire operational approach around never letting it happen again. Oberst Ludwig Krug, commanding the German 736th Infantry Regiment defending Juno Beach, had studied the ground carefully. He was confident in his defenses, The beach was layered with obstacles: Belgian gates, hedgehogs, stakes tipped with mines, designed to rip the bottoms from landing craft. Behind the waterline sat concrete emplacements housing heavy machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces registered on every square meter of the approach. The villages of Courseulles-sur-Mer, Bernières-sur-Mer, and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer had been converted into fortresses. Buildings were reinforced with concrete. Windows were turned into firing positions. Every alley, every courtyard, every garden wall had been woven into a defensive network. Krug had approximately 400 men holding the initial line. More were positioned in depth. He had armor support available. His artillery could range from the beach back into the water. He believed his position was impregnable. He was not entirely wrong to believe that. The problem for the Canadians began before they reached the beach. The original plan called for the assault to begin at low tide, early enough that the landing craft could thread between the obstacle lines and deposit men on the flat, firm sand below the waterline. But the tide ran differently than expected on the morning of June 6th. By the time the landing craft were in position, the tide had already begun rising. Obstacles that should have been visible and avoidable were now submerged, invisible, lethal, waiting. Landing craft began striking mines. Some simply disappeared in a column of water and smoke. Men who had survived the crossing, who had been sick and cold and terrified for the last 2 hours, were thrown into the sea with nothing between them and the bottom but their heavy kit. Those who reached the beach found themselves arriving in the worst possible way. Late, scattered, in the wrong sequence, with some of the specialized armor that was supposed to precede them still struggling in the surf, and the German guns were awake. Unlike Omaha Beach to the west, where a combination of bad planning, bad weather, and catastrophically bad luck would kill nearly 2,000 Americans in a single morning, Juno Beach had a factor that Omaha did not. The Canadians had planned for things to go wrong. Their units had been trained to operate without clear communication, without support, on their flanks without the exact conditions they expected. Individual soldiers had been briefed so thoroughly that sergeants could lead companies, corporals could lead platoons, privates could lead sections. When the commanders went down, and they did go down in the first minutes, in shocking numbers, the formations didn't collapse. They kept moving. Private W.A. Olmsted of the Regina Rifle Regiment would later recall, "There wasn't time to think. There wasn't time to be scared in the way you'd be scared waiting. You just moved. You moved." Because stopping meant dying. That ethos, move forward, keep moving, don't stop, was the soul of what the 3rd Canadian Division did at Juno Beach on the morning of June 6th. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Regina Rifle Regiment hit the beach at Courseulles. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada and Le Régiment de la Chaudière landed at Bernières. The North Shore, New Brunswick Regiment, and the Fort Garry Horse hit Saint-Aubin. Each of these assaults deserves its own story. Together they form a single story. The story of a day when Canadian soldiers were handed the most difficult assignment of the entire Normandy operation, and performed it with a ferocity and discipline that left the defenders stunned. At Courseulles, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles approached a position that should have been suppressed by naval bombardment. It had not been. The concrete emplacement housing a heavy machine gun was intact, and it opened fire the moment the ramps dropped. The men who went into the water from the first wave did not have cover. They did not have armor support. The modified tanks were still fighting through the surf behind them. They had rifles and determination, and the memory of everything they had been taught and everything they had lost. They crossed the beach, not because it was easy, not because the fire slackened, but because the alternative, stopping, going to, ground on the sand, waiting, was a sentence of death. The entire geometry of an exposed beach favors the defender. The only way to break it is to move so fast that the defense cannot track all of the threats simultaneously. the Winnipeg rifles moved fast. Within minutes of landing, sections of men were at the wire. Within minutes more, they were through the wire and into the trenches behind the sea-wall. The fighting became close, rifle butt and bayonet, and the short, savage grammar of men fighting in confined spaces. German defenders who had been trained and experienced and confident in their emplacements found themselves suddenly confronted with Canadians who had come through their entire outer defensive layer and were now inside their position. Courcelles fell. The Queen's Own rifles at Bernières faced something different and arguably more dangerous. The modified armor, the Hobart's funnies, the specially designed tanks that could swim ashore, lay bridges, and clear mines, had been unable to reach the beach ahead of the infantry. The Queen's Own went in alone. The seawall at Bernières was over a meter high. Behind it, firing through prepared apertures, were German soldiers with interlocking fields of fire that covered every meter of the approach. The landing craft dropped their ramps in 2 meters of water. Men carrying over 30 kilograms of kit struggled to keep their heads above the surface. Machine gun fire cut across the beach in long, sweeping arcs. Company A of the Queen's Own rifles lost more than half its men in the first 90 seconds. 90 seconds! That is not a figure from a history textbook. It is a human measurement. The time it takes to boil a kettle, to walk across a room, to take a breath and let it out 3 times. In 90 seconds, men who had trained for 2 years, who had crossed an ocean, who had kissed photographs of wives and mothers in the dark of the landing craft, half of them were gone. What happened next was one of the most astonishing things in the history of Canadian arms. The survivors didn't stop. They reached the seawall. They found gaps. They found drains and rubble and the bodies of the men ahead of them, and they climbed over all of it, and they got into Bernières. And once they were in Bernières, once they were fighting in streets and gardens and the rooms of Norman farmhouses, the carefully constructed German defense began to come apart, because it had been designed for a beach. It had been designed for men in the water, men in the open, men far enough away that range and elevation gave the defender every advantage. It had not been designed for Canadians already in your kitchen. The commander of the 716th Infantry Division, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, received his first reports from the beach positions at approximately 8:15 in the morning. What he heard did not make sense. The Canadians had been in the water. The obstacles were in place. The guns were registered. The defenses had been constructed over months, and yet his forward positions were reporting breaches. Multiple breaches, simultaneous breaches, in sectors that were supposed to be mutually supporting. Richter ordered counterattacks. He requested armor. He attempted to establish a new defensive line in depth. But the nature of what was happening at Juno was not simply a tactical breach at one point in the line. It was a methodical, relentless dismantling of his entire defensive system simultaneously, at multiple points, by men who seemed to understand exactly how that system worked and had come prepared to break every piece of it. German accounts from the day, collected by historians in the decades after the war, describe a particular quality to the Canadian assault that commanders found difficult to categorize. These were not the attacks of untrained conscripts throwing themselves at a position in human waves, nor were they the cautious, methodical advances of soldiers waiting for perfect conditions. They were something in between, aggressive to the point of recklessness, but tactically coherent. Soldiers who were clearly frightened, clearly taking terrible losses, but who kept making sound decisions under fire. Sections that had lost their officers and NCOs and yet continued to advance on the correct objectives by the correct routes. Hauptmann Ernst Düring, whose unit held positions inland from Bernières, would later describe the sensation of watching the Canadian advance from his command post. They did not behave like men who had just come from the sea. They behaved like men who already knew the ground. That was, in a sense, literally true. The 3rd Canadian Division had studied the Normandy terrain from aerial photographs, from French resistance reports, from pre-war vacation films and postcards, gathered by intelligence services. They had built scale models. They had walked through mock-ups of the villages. They knew, as well as any force could know without having been there, exactly what they were going to find. Knowledge is not the same as experience. But on a beach where the first 90 seconds could kill half a company, knowledge was the difference between cohesion and collapse. By mid-morning, the situation at Juno had reversed in a way that German headquarters was still struggling to process. The beach was not secured in the sense of being quiet or safe. It would not be that for many hours, and the cost of every meter was being measured in blood. But the forward German positions, the ones designed to stop the landing before it became a lodgment, had been broken. The Canadians were in the villages. They were moving inland, and they were not stopping. This last point was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential tactical decisions of the entire D-Day operation, and it was not made by a general. It was made by thousands of individual Canadian soldiers and junior officers, independently, simultaneously, in response to the same instinct baked into them by training and by the memory of Dieppe. The beach is the most dangerous place. Get off it. Get inland. Get to ground that gives you cover and makes the defenders move, because defenders moving are defenders dying. The villages fell. Then the fields beyond the villages. Then the roads leading inland. By early afternoon, the 3rd Canadian Division had advanced further inland than any other Allied formation on D-Day. That is not a footnote. That is the headline. On a day when the American soldiers at Omaha Beach were still pinned at the waterline, when the carefully constructed timetable of the entire Overlord operation was beginning to wobble, the Canadians at Juno had broken through the beach defenses, captured their initial objectives, and were pushing toward the first day's ultimate goal. The Camp Bayou Highway, over 10 kilometers from the water's edge. They did not reach it. The truth requires that acknowledgement. The momentum that carried them through the beach slowed as the day wore on, as units became mixed and supply lines stretched, and the inland defenses stiffened with German reinforcements rushing forward. The 3rd Division would fall short of their most ambitious objectives by nightfall. But what they had achieved by then was already extraordinary. To understand what German commanders thought of the Canadian performance, you have to step back from the beach and look at the map. The German defense of Normandy rested on a fundamental strategic assumption. The Allies could be stopped at the waterline, or at worst within the first few kilometers of the beach, long, enough for armored reserves, specifically the panzer divisions held back under Hitler's direct control, to arrive and drive them into the sea. This assumption required the beach defenses to hold for hours. It required the initial assault waves to be destroyed or pinned in the surf and on the sand. It required, above all, that the defenders maintain the psychological initiative, that the attackers feel themselves in a killing ground, exposed, suppressed, unable to advance. At Juno, the Canadians had destroyed that assumption within the first hour. Generalleutnant Richter, attempting to understand what had happened, made a series of urgent calls to Corps headquarters. The picture he described was not of a defense under pressure. It was of a defense that had already ceased to exist in the sectors hit by the Canadians. His forward units were not fighting the enemy from prepared positions. They were retreating through fields, fighting in ditches, attempting to establish improvised defensive lines in terrain they had never expected to defend. The psychological impact on the German defenders at the tactical level was equally significant. The Atlantic Wall, the name given to the entire system of fortifications along the European coastline, had been built as much as a propaganda instrument as a military one. It was supposed to be impregnable. German soldiers manning those positions had been told, repeatedly, that the fortifications were invincible, that the sea itself would destroy any landing, that even if men reached the beach, the obstacles and guns and concrete would grind them to nothing. The Canadians had walked through it, not metaphorically, literally walked through it, across beaches swept by machine gun fire, over seawalls, through minefields, into fortified villages, and come out the other side, with their formations largely intact and their momentum unbroken. For a soldier, who has been told his position is impregnable and then watches it fall in under an hour, the psychological wound is deep. It doesn't just affect the men in that position. It propagates backwards through every unit that receives the news. Hans von Luck, a senior German officer whose memoirs are among the more candid accounts of the Normandy campaign, would later write about the reports reaching German headquarters that morning with a phrase that has lodged itself in the historical record. The Canadians had shown, he noted, an aggression that was unexpected from a colonial force. The word unexpected is doing significant work in that sentence. It is the word of a man who had made an assumption and watched it fail. To the men fighting their way inland through Normandy's bocage country, the dense, ancient hedgerows that turned every field into a potential ambush, none of the strategic accounting mattered yet. They were fighting for the next 100 meters, the next farmhouse, the next road junction. The bocage was a revelation of a particular kind of horror. The hedgerows of Normandy, earthen banks topped with thick tangles of roots and vegetation, some of them hundreds of years old, turned the landscape into a series of natural fortifications. Each hedgerow was a wall. Each gap in a hedgerow was a potential killing ground. Artillery couldn't suppress what it couldn't see. Armor couldn't advance without infantry. Infantry couldn't advance without knowing what was on the other side of the next bank. The 3rd Division worked through this terrain with the methodical aggression that had defined their beach assault. Section by section, field by field. The losses accumulated. The objectives fell, slowly, expensively, in the brutal arithmetic of close country fighting. What sustained them, what sustains any formation through that kind of grinding attrition, was a combination of unit cohesion, leadership at the small unit level, and something harder to quantify. The sense that what they were doing was working, that they were moving forward, that the alternative was not stasis, but defeat and death, and the waste of everything they had already given. Private Stan Sislowski of the Perth Regiment, who came ashore in the later waves, described the inland advance this way: "Every man who had gone ahead of us was a debt we owed. You didn't think about it consciously, but you moved because they had moved, and stopping would have meant their deaths counted for nothing." In the headquarters of Army Group B, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been away from Normandy on the night of June 5th, convinced by the weather that no landing was imminent, was receiving reports throughout June 6th that told a coherent and alarming story. The landings had succeeded. The beach defenses had been broken. The Allies were ashore in force. Rommel's strategy for defending Normandy had been predicated on stopping the invasion at the waterline. He had argued, against significant opposition from other German commanders, that the panzer reserves needed to be positioned close enough to the beaches to counterattack within hours of any landing. He had been overruled. The reserves were held back. Now, with the Allies ashore and moving inland, those reserves were being released. But they were moving through roads that Allied air power was already beginning to interdict, in daylight, against fighter-bomber attacks that turned every highway into a gamble with life. The window that Rommel had said needed to remain open, the window in which German armor could reach the beaches and drive the Allies back, was closing. At Juno, it was already closed. The Canadians had advanced far enough inland that a successful German counterattack to the waterline would require pushing through over 10 kilometers of increasingly fortified Allied-held ground, under continuous air attack, against men who had spent the last 12 hours building fighting positions and establishing supply lines. The theoretical possibility of driving the Canadians back into the sea had not vanished. Military possibilities rarely vanish entirely. But it had become practically unfeasible in the time it would take to assemble and launch the necessary forces. This was not an accident. It was the direct result of the depth of the Canadian advance. There is a document that surfaced in the years after the war, a post-action analysis compiled by the staff of the 716th Infantry Division, attempting to explain what had happened. On June 6th, it is not a dramatic document. It is written in the careful, bureaucratic German of military assessment. But certain passages have attracted the attention of historians precisely because they are so careful, so measured, in their attempt to account for something that the analysts clearly found difficult to fully explain. The Canadians, the analysis, concludes, had displayed an unusual degree of small unit initiative combined with effective tactical preparation. It notes that their assault had exploited the gaps between defensive positions in a manner that suggested detailed advance planning and thorough familiarity with defensive system architecture. It describes the speed of their inland advance as extraordinary given the obstacles encountered. These are not compliments from a generous adversary. They are the conclusions of professional soldiers trying to understand how their carefully constructed defense had been unraveled so quickly. The answer they arrived at, small unit initiative, thorough preparation, speed, was accurate. What they could not fully account for was the human element beneath those clinical descriptions. The small unit initiative came from men who had been trained to think for themselves in chaos. The thorough preparation came from the memory of Dieppe, and from the determination that what had happened on those cliffs in 1942 would never happen again. The speed came from something deeper still. The understanding, built through 2 years of training and sharpened to a point on that beach, that forward momentum was not just a tactical advantage, it was survival. By the end of June 6, 1944, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had landed approximately 21,400 men at Juno Beach. They had suffered approximately 1,074 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. It was the highest casualty figure of any Canadian formation in a single day since the First World War, and it was also proportionally lower than what had been projected for the operation. The planners had estimated as many as 3,000 casualties for the Juno assault. The beach had been breached. The initial defensive line had been broken. The villages had been taken. The advance inland had been deeper than any other Allied formations. On D-Day, the cost was real. The achievement was real. Both deserved to be held in the same breath. In the town of Bernières-sur-Mer, a French woman named Geneviève Dubosc watched the Canadians come through her street and would later describe the moment in terms that became one of the small, luminous details in an enormous story. They were filthy. They were exhausted. Some of them were bleeding. They looked at us with these very serious faces, and then one of them smiled, a young one, and said something in English I didn't understand. But I understood the smile. It meant, "We're here. We came." The battle for Normandy would continue for another 2 months. Brutal, grinding, attritive fighting through bocage and urban rubble, and the open wheat fields south of Caen. The Canadians would fight at Carpiquet, at Caen, at Falaise. Battles that would demand equal measures of courage and sacrifice and receive, in the public memory of the war, far less attention than the beach that preceded them. But June 6th was the foundation, and Juno was the hinge. Understanding why requires stepping back one more time to look at the whole map of the Normandy landings and what the Canadian performance at Juno meant for the operation as a whole. The 5 beaches were not independent operations. They were pieces of a single design. The plan required all 5 to succeed, or at minimum, to succeed sufficiently that the Germans could not concentrate their response against any single landing point. If one beach held firm and the others advanced, the defenders at the held beach could be flanked, cut off, destroyed. When Omaha Beach became a catastrophe in the early hours, when the Americans were pinned at the waterline and taking casualties, at a rate that genuinely threatened the entire western flank of the operation, the performance at the other beaches became existentially important. The Canadian success at Juno and the British successes at Gold and Sword meant that even if Omaha collapsed entirely, the Allies would have a bridgehead. The invasion would have succeeded. The lodgment would exist. Omaha did not collapse. American soldiers found, through enormous sacrifice and individual courage, a way off that beach. But they found it knowing that on both their flanks, the line was holding, the advance was progressing, the invasion was working. The Canadians at Juno were part of the reason those American soldiers had something to hold toward. In the weeks after, June 6th, as German headquarters struggled to stabilize a front that was dissolving faster than reserves could be committed, a pattern emerged in the intelligence assessments being compiled about the Allied forces. The Americans were noted for firepower and logistics. The British were noted for deliberate, methodical, operational planning. The Canadians were noted for something that the German analysts seemed to find harder to categorize. Oberst Heinz Werner Schmid, an intelligence officer on Rommel's staff, wrote in a July 1944 assessment, "The Canadian formations demonstrate a particular combination of qualities that complicates defensive planning. They are aggressive without being reckless. They are flexible at the small unit level without being undisciplined. They have shown a consistent tendency to advance beyond expected objectives when conditions permit. Advance beyond expected objectives when conditions permit." That is the German assessment of what the Canadians did at Juno Beach in the first hours of D-Day, translated into the precise language of military analysis. It is a sentence that, read carefully, contains an acknowledgement that goes beyond tactical assessment. It is the acknowledgement of men who had built their defenses around expectations, and had watched those expectations fail. The town of Courseulles-sur-Mer still stands. The seawall still stands. The concrete emplacement where the machine gun that cut down the first wave of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles once sat is still there. Weathered, moss-covered, silent now. Visitors who go to Juno Beach today walk across the same sand that the men of the 3rd Canadian Division crossed on the morning of June 6, 1944. The beach looks different at low tide than it did that morning. Quieter, obviously. Mundane in the way that significant places often look once the event has passed. But the distance is worth measuring. Walk from the waterline to the seawall. Count the seconds it takes you to cross the open sand. Then multiply those seconds by the weight of the kit those men were carrying. Then add the water. Then add the obstacles in the water. Then add the machine gun fire. Then ask yourself what it took to cross that distance and keep moving. The answer is not simple. Military historians have debated the relative contributions of planning, training, leadership, luck, and national character for decades, and those debates are not resolved here. What can be said? What the documents and the accounts and the German assessments all point toward is that the Canadians at Juno Beach on June 6, 1944, performed with a quality of collective determination that exceeded what any prior analysis of their capabilities had projected. They had earned that quality through grief, through the memory of Dieppe, through 2 years of preparation that was not abstract but visceral, rooted in the specific, knowledge of what happened when preparation failed. They had sustained it through training, through the deliberate cultivation of small unit initiative, the careful distribution of tactical knowledge down to the lowest levels of the organization, the building of formations that could function without top-down direction in the chaos of a contested beach. And they had demonstrated it in 90 seconds, of fire and forward movement that broke a defensive line that the Germans had been confident no seaborne assault could break. What German generals said when Canadian infantry first broke their line at Normandy was measured and professional, and carefully constructed to explain the inexplicable. But underneath the bureaucratic language of post-action reports and divisional assessments, the message was simple. They had not expected this. They had not expected men from the prairies of Saskatchewan and the fishing towns of New Brunswick and the factories of Ontario and the farms of Quebec to cross a killing ground that was designed to be uncrossable, to absorb catastrophic losses and keep moving, to arrive inside a fortified position before the defenders could psychologically process what was happening. They had not expected the Canadians. The Canadians had expected themselves. That is the difference. That is what a beach looks like when men decide, collectively, that the only direction is forward. The sea at Juno is quiet now. The tide comes in and goes out, as it has for 1,000 years, as it did on the morning of June 6, 1944. The sand holds no record of what happened there, but the ground inland, every field, every hedgerow, every Norman village between the beach and the Cambayou Highway, was shaped by what those men did in those first hours. 14,000 Canadians crossed that water. They did not all come back, but they came.